Psalm 77. The first thing I'll say before I read it through is a lot of people think that all the Psalms were written by David, right? David wrote all the Psalms. That's not the case with all the Psalms. Some of the Psalms were actually written as a part of a community exercise. And this is one of those Psalms. This isn't a Psalm of David. This is actually a Psalm of the community of Israel. So all of Israel would have come together or someone would have been like a representative for Israel and written this Psalm. And this is how all the people are feeling. So this isn't just like one person. This is everyone in the nation of Israel, which I think sort of puts a whole new spin on it, especially because I think as a country right now, we're asking a lot of questions, like the world is asking a lot of questions, so it's not just about individual doubt and anger, it's also community. So let's look at Psalm 77. This is what it says. I cry aloud to God, and he will hear me. In the day of my trouble, I seek the Lord. In the night, my hand is stretched out without wearying. My soul refuses to be comforted. When I remember God, I moan. When I meditate, my spirit faints. And then Salah. Does anyone know what Salah means in the Hebrew Bible? Salah, if you come across it in a psalm, basically just means like, okay, take a pause. Like, reflect on this, wait a minute. I think it's cool that it's part of the Psalms because sometimes we just zoom through when we're reading our Bibles. But this is basically an indicator to say like, okay, now sit with this for a second. And this is a really intensive opening to a song, right? When I meditate, my spirit faints, my soul refuses to be comforted. This person or this community is in a lot of pain, a lot of anguish. And so, this community is obviously doubting God. We've been sort of looking at, okay, what do we do with doubt? And the first thing we've been talking about, right, is consider the source of the doubt. So last week, with the serpent in the garden, he was the source of the doubt. And so you go, oh, well, that's not a good source. We should not, listen to what the serpent says. But what if the source of the doubt is God himself? Like, what do we do then when we are actually doubting God? We might not be doubting our friends or our parents or other people in our lives, but it's God himself, and that's what the community is dealing with right now. So how do we work through that? How do we go forward, right? If God is the source of that, what does that mean for our Christian walk? Have we fallen away from God if we're angry at him, if we have questions for him? So that's one thing that I think we need to consider. And when we keep going through the psalm, I think you'll see that it actually gives us an answer to that question. Like, how do we go forward if we're doubting God? So let's jump into the next little bit. It says, you hold my eyelids open, talking about God here. I am so troubled that I cannot speak. I consider the days of old, the years long ago. I said, let me remember my song in the night. Let me meditate in my heart. Then my spirit made a diligent search. And so this community is so upset. They're so troubled. They don't even feel like they can speak out about anything. And then they say, okay, let me make a diligent search, meaning let me figure out why this is going on. Like, why do I feel this way, right? They're doing exactly what we've been talking about. Let's consider where this is coming from. And so what do they say? They ask really, really hard questions of God, really intense, honest questions. They say, will the Lord spurn forever? Basically meaning like, is the Lord going to continue to punish us forever? Will he never again be favorable? Has his steadfast love forever ceased? Are his promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in anger shut up his compassion? Obviously, this community is really hurting and is really upset with God. And these are really valid questions to have. And I love that this is a part of the Bible, right? This is a part of what we consider the holy word of God, is actually a community talking to God and saying, like, where the heck are you? I don't know about you guys, but I've had times in my life, and we've talked about it during the mental health series as well with some of our leaders, but these are questions that, like, in some way or another, I have had for God. Like, are you never going to be gracious to me again? Like, where are your promises? Are you going to show up? And then, again, Salah, right? Okay, now stop and think about these things. So I want you guys to just read through these questions one more time and try and put yourself in this community's shoes. See if it resonates with you. So just by yourselves, read these questions one more time before we move on to our next point. they're pretty harsh. Like they're pretty pointed at God. They don't really hold back the punches. And so we move on to sort of our second part of how we've been dealing with doubt. So the first is consider the source, right? Where is this doubt coming from? Well, the doubt itself seems to be coming from God. Okay, so then what are the consequences? What are the consequences of doubting God? Does it mean that we lose our faith? Does it mean that we can no longer be Christians? Does it mean that God isn't who he says he is? How do we go forward? What does that mean if we end up doubting and asking God these really tough questions? Is it okay to doubt God, to question him? Can God take it? Does God listen to those questions and go, you know what, I'm done with you. Like, I'm done with this person. I'm not going to deal with it anymore. Does he ever turn his back on us and forsake us? I don't think he does. And we're going to learn about that and listen to the rest of the psalm. But there's an analogy, there's a story that I think works really well to sort of show what happens when we doubt God. Like, what are the consequences of that doubt? Has anyone heard of the story Pilgrim's Progress before? Anyone heard of Pilgrim's Progress? Okay, a few people. Pilgrim's Progress is one of my favorite stories ever. It's really worth the read if you guys haven't read it. It's all about this guy named Christian, and it's basically a story of how he is on a journey to heaven. And it's just all these allegories about life. And there's a point in the story where Christian gets to this fork in the road, and he has to figure out, where do I want to go? Do I want to go on the narrow path, or do I want to go on sort of the wider path? And of course, the Christian walk tells us, take the narrow path, right? Take the narrow way, follow Jesus. But Christian's tired from his journey. He's with his friend. His friend is called Hopeful. And he's like, you know what? I don't think that the narrow path is working out for us anymore. Let's go to this wide path. And so what happens is they end up coming to this place, and in the book it's called the Doubting Castle. All right, it's this castle that's supposed to represent like their doubt, right? They doubt that they should go this way. They end up going the other way, and they're in this place called Doubting Castle. And Doubting Castle is run by this huge giant, and the giant's name is Despair, right? It's really it's quite easy to understand. But this giant's name is Despair, and he takes Christian and Hopeful, and he locks them up in this dungeon in this Doubting Castle, and they're there for a really, really long time. And they're there pondering, should we take our own lives? Should we just kill each other to end this misery? It's pretty gruesome. And it's supposed to represent sort of the stages in our Christian walk where we can be totally doubtful of God, where we can be in places of deep, dark, intense depression. They're talking about actual suicide. And I love that it's part of the book because it shows a real representation of what often happens in the Christian life. But after a time in this dungeon, Christian realizes, I have this key with me. And the key that he has is called Promise. That's the key's name. It's called Promise. And it's the Promise key. And he goes, you know what? I think this promise will open any door in Doubting Castle. And it does, right? The promise opens the door, and him and Hopeful escape. They get out of Doubting Castle. And the way it's presented in the story is beautiful because what they do is they go back to that fork in the road where they had originally jumped off, and they can just keep going on their way. And it's a beautiful picture showing we might be in those places of doubt. You can get back to that point where you can get on the narrow path again. There is no dungeon that is going to be so full of despair that you can't get out. And that's where the promise of God comes in. And that's what I think our response should be, when we doubt God. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. It's despair or promise, right? Doubt can lead us to that place where we are in just total darkness, right? Total despair, total anger towards God. Or it can actually lead us to a place where we go, what has God promised to do, and what is he going to do going forward? So let's move on to just the last little bit of this song. This is what the community says. Then I said, okay, I will appeal to this, meaning, okay, we're in this place, it's horrible, we're asking God, where the heck are you? Are you ever going to come through for us? We are really doubting you right now, we're really upset with you. But then the community goes, okay, but let's think about this a little bit differently. It says, I will appeal to the years of the right hand of the Most High. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your wonders of old. I will ponder all your work, and I will meditate on your mighty deeds. And one of the beautiful things I loved about our mental health series was when people share about the ways that God has worked in their lives and brought them out of situations, those act as these things that we look back on and remember. So one of the ways that we move away from doubt and out of despair is to remember the promises that God has made and to remember the things that he's done. It's all about going back and saying, if he's done this before, why wouldn't he do it again? It continues, your way, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God? They sort of get to this point where they're like, we're really upset with God right now, but like, what God is great like our God? There's no other God like ours. You are the God who works wonders. You have made known your might among the peoples. You, with your arm, redeemed your people, the children of Jacob and Joseph, Salah. And again, it's asking us to, okay, now sit with this for a second. We've moved from this place of doubt and despair to remembering, okay, God has done this in the past. Why wouldn't he keep doing it for us now? Right? Why wouldn't he? And the tough thing is, when you're in those moments of despair, when you're in that dungeon of the doubting castle, it can be tough to remember these things, but that's the value of God's word and the value of Christian community, right? And the last thing we've been talking about is, okay, let's consider the truth, right? When we have doubts in our mind, what is the truth? And when we talk about truth, we are actually thinking of one person. Who's a person when we think of truth? Youth group answer, anyone? Jesus, yeah, Jesus, right? Jesus says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. So when we think about truth, we should always have our minds drawn back to the person of Jesus. What does Jesus have to do with this, if Jesus is the actual truth, right? And I think the wonderful thing about Jesus' death on the cross, obviously a horrific event, but it is something that we can look back and point to and go, okay, I know that right now God seems far away. I know right now I have doubts about God, but I can point back and say, God loved me so much that he did this. This is something that I can remember. I know that this has happened. One of the great things that I love about Christianity is even non-Christians, no one can deny that a person named Jesus from Nazareth in the first century died on a cross. Like, it's just historical fact. And that is the thing that we point to, right? When we are in the doubting castle going, what is the truth going forward? This is the mighty deed. This is the great work that we look back on and go, oh my goodness, God has saved his people, but in an ultimate act, he has saved us, right? He has saved us from spiritual death. And so when we consider the truth, we consider the person of Jesus. I love the end of this psalm, and we'll finish up with this. I want you guys now to, as we're reading through the last little bits of this psalm, be thinking about, okay, what does this say about Jesus? When we consider the truth, what is something about Jesus that is evident here in the closing of this? It says, when the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled, the clouds poured out water, the skies gave forth thunder, your arrows flashed on every side, the crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind, your lightnings lighted up the world, the earth trembled and shook. And the community right now is thinking of what event? Does anyone know? In the history of Israel, what are they thinking of? Yeah.
Noah's Ark.
Close, almost. Yeah, that's not a bad one. Yeah, any other guesses on what the community is thinking of right now?
My Bible says the Red Sea.
Yes, very good. They are thinking of the parting of the Red Sea, right? They are thinking of when God works to bring the people out of slavery in Egypt, and that's what they're remembering. But when we think about this with Jesus, does anything come to mind? Like any stories about Jesus here that this text sort of speaks to? Anyone? Any thoughts? No? How about Jesus calming the storm? Right? I love what it says here. When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled. And of course, I love that it points back to God saving his people and splitting the Red Sea. But it's also Jesus, right, calming the waves. And, that acts as that source of truth, something that we can point to. And that's, I think, one of the purposes of all the stories we have of Jesus. The last one. Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. Again, pointing back to him saving them out of the Red Sea. But is there any story here when you read these words, you go, that reminds me of something Jesus did? Anyone? Ian? Yeah, exactly. Jesus walking on water. Like, when the Israelites would have probably heard the story about Jesus, how would they not have thought of this psalm going, yet your footprints were unseen on the waters? And the point is that even in these times of doubt, when the community is angry at God, they have something to point back to. They have something to bring them back. It's that